Good morning and welcome to this GSA Insights webinar, where we will examine the current and future use of UHF spectrum across ITU Region 1 and discuss the question as to whether its diverse usage means there's a case for more flexibility in the band. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. Following the presentation of the research by Plum Consulting, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A with the report author, Tim Miller. Please do feel free to submit any questions you have as we go on through the presentation. Just use the questions function you'll see on the right side of your screen, and then we'll be able to see those questions and put them to Tim during the Q&A session. This will then be followed by a roundtable discussion where we'll be joined by senior regulatory representatives from all four corners of ITU Region 1, including AFNR, CRAN, NIIR, and the TDRA. Again, if you have any questions you'd like to put to the panel, please do submit them in the same way, and Uli, the panel moderator, will be able to draw on them to inform the conversation. And finally, we will be sharing a link to the full research report immediately after this event, together with a recording. But to open today's webinar, I'd first like to hand you over to Uli Rafus, head of the GSA low bands team, to formally kick things off. Uli.
Yeah, thanks very much to Richard for this kind introduction. So I think we have quite some impressive resonance on the topic. So a very warm welcome to our large audience here. We hope that the report to be presented today can really meaningfully contribute to these discussions on UHF, which happen on the WRC Agenda 23 under Agenda Item 1.5 for ITU Region 1, and which affects multiple industries. Also, a very warm welcome to Tim Miller, and many thanks to him and his team at Plum for this very comprehensive work. So we really look forward to today's presentation, and also then your questions and the answers to those on the report. But then last, certainly not least, a very warm welcome and many thanks to our distinguished panelists representing administrations throughout ITU Region 1 who join us today in order to share and discuss their views. I'm very sorry that we had a change in terms of the panel. Jonas Wessel, having been invited, had to decline on short notice. So you have to bear with me today as a moderator. I hope that is okay with everyone. So GSA is the Global Mobile Supplier Association, and we represent the industry voice of the global mobile ecosystem since 1998. My name is Ulrich Refus. I'm with Nokia, and in GSA I have the role to chair the low band matters discussions. So GSA provides information relevant for the mobile industry in forms of free reports on the website and so forth. So you also find, as Richard just mentioned, today's report there very soon. So furthermore, there is very detailed information available for devices, on technologies, on features, on network rollouts and so forth in our Gambot database. And GSA certainly also is heavily engaged in the discussions on this Agenda Item 1.5, and which considers, on the one hand side, the current use of UHF in 470 to 960 megahertz, and then possible regulatory actions in the frequency range 470 to 694 megahertz for ITU Region 1. Thus, GSA has asked Plum Consulting, with their expertise, to have a deep and detailed look into that matter. Gather all the up-to-date information on this quite diverse situation of the use of the spectrum throughout the region, and give their recommendation from a perspective on how to best meet the political targets like inclusion and best possible welfare to consumers and businesses. So without further ado, let me pass on the floor to Tim to present the study and its findings. Thanks very much.
Hi there, Uli, and hello to everyone. I hope that you can hear me okay. I'm going to talk you through our findings from this study we've carried out for the GSA. As Uli was saying, they asked us to have a look at the use of UHF, both now and in the future. And there is a report that we've put together, which will be downloadable, I believe, from the GSA website very soon, that looks into this in a lot more detail than I'll be able to cover in half an hour today. But the idea of this presentation is to go through and have a look at what it is that we cover in the report. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk you through the agenda. In fact, I can control this, can't I? Because it's very clever. So what are we going to be talking about? First of all, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to what UHF spectrum is. I'm aware that most people on the call here know a lot about it, so I'm not going to dwell on it for very long. And then I'm going to start looking into how it's currently used and how it can be used. So first of all, we know that UHF is used by mobile, especially in the bands above 700 megahertz. It's also used by television in the bands below 700 megahertz. But there are other users as well that we need to think about. And then at the end, we're going to be talking about choice, regulators' choice, and the ability to flex how the spectrum is used, depending on the needs of a country. So, starting off with a brief background. In Region 1, UHF is historically significant, not just for television, which is where it started being used, but also for a number of other users. In the 1960s, it was allocated to high definition TV, this being effectively what we have as we now know as standard definition. And then over time that has evolved into digital television, high definition digital television, and so on. That still is an important use, as we will show later. In addition to that, you've got radio astronomy, which has been allocated channel 38 at 606 megahertz in the band. I say allocated, it's not a formal allocation, but it's where a lot of the equipment historically has sat. PMSC is an important user of this spectrum as well. Generally, it uses spectrum where broadcasting is not using it. And then on top of that, you've got the mobile use. And of course, the mobile use has expanded over time from just using the 900 megahertz band in Region 1 down to 800, down to 700. And the 700 is in the process of being awarded and rolled out. So given all of this previous history, we're left with this sort of diagram here that shows where people are currently using it. You can see a nice slice for DTT on the left-hand side, but of course that's much lower than it used to be because the 5G and the LTE sections that are on this diagram used to be used by DTT, or rather analog broadcasting and DTT beforehand. I've sort of put 2G and 3G sharing the same space. That's largely because you've had an amount of refarming from operators. To some extent, you've also got some 2G happening in 800, but there's also other bands, obviously, that use it as well. I think it's important to just note the little purple, sorry, the little orange slither on the bottom left, which you probably can't read, that says radio astronomy, and that's sort of a secondary use in the DTT band. But generally, a lot of regulators require that DTT does not interfere with that to the greatest extent possible. But there is, of course, a geographic element to the sharing there. So given that that is where we are, you may think that there's a kind of a nice, clear, tidy picture there. But we think that there is a need to rethink how this is currently working. And the questions that we've been asking ourselves and asking others is, first of all, is the spectrum being used in the most efficient way? Not only is it being used efficiently, but are the needs of all the users of the spectrum being met? Are historical users actually still reliant on UHF, or are they working elsewhere in other bands or on other technologies? And then the last question, which I think is possibly the most important one we've asked, is an allocation at the ITU region level for UHF spectrum appropriate? We'll come on to those questions, but I think that it's worthwhile keeping these in mind as we go through. Let's talk about the use by mobile. Just so you're aware, I'm not going to be going through everything on these slides. The slides will be available afterwards, I believe. I think Richard will confirm, but we will enable you to kind of to download these and have a look. And if not, then we'll make sure that they're on our website anyway. So UHF has been a key band for mobile over the past 3 decades, starting off, as I said earlier, with the 900 megahertz and moving down over time. On this slide, we talk about different band plans in different regions. You've got 900, you've got 850, you've got 800, you've got 700, and you've got 600. 600 is being used in the US because of their historical location of television broadcasting and a low DCT rollout. But it's worthwhile thinking about the fact that actually, as technology has improved and new technologies have come on board, then operators had to do 2 things. First of all, they've had to refarm the spectrum they had already, but also they've had to acquire more spectrum. And they've acquired spectrum not just in the UHF band, as you can see here, but also they've acquired spectrum elsewhere to try and make sure that there is sufficient capacity across the entire spectrum portfolio. But UHF is very important, and we'll come on to that very shortly. Why is it that we are moving to new technologies and increasing capacity? Well, it's simply because demand is going up. Demand is going up massively. On this slide, you can see 2 different things showing demand increasing massively. First of all, general internet use is increasing at an exponential rate. And you can see on the left-hand side, this comes from Cisco, looking at the way that mobile and fixed and managed IP services are increasing. Mobile is still the minority in terms of the internet traffic, but it is actually an increasing proportion, as you can see. And a large part of that is its use in developing countries as well as developed. On the right-hand side is another very interesting thing, looking at the use of mobile internet and what sort of applications people are using. The largest by far is video. And not only is it the largest by far, but again, it is increasing in importance. And that is not just because people are watching cat videos on their phone more often. It is because the quality of video is increasing. You have better resolution on handsets, and people are also starting to use mobile traffic for driving other screens as well. So it's very important that we take account of this need for the ability to stream high quality video on a mobile system. Generally, these 2 slides together illustrate a very important, 2 very important things. First of all, we need to make sure we have a very large increasing capacity on mobile networks, and secondly, it needs to have the right sort of bandwidth, not just the amount of traffic that can be carried. Having said that, we have a very different set of graphs on this page, looking at the way that mobile coverage is found around the world. You've got a tale of 2, I was going to say a tale of 2 cities, it's a tale of 2 regions here. The urban areas on the left-hand side, as you can see, have very, very good coverage in general. In Asia Pacific, former Russia and former USSR and Europe, you have pretty much 100% 4G coverage in urban areas. The Americas is 98%, but in Africa and the Arab states, there are still some areas that are just covered by 3G, but it's a falling number. However, when you look in rural areas on the right-hand side, you can see that a significant area is only covered by 3G. A still large area is covered only by 2G, and there are still many areas which are not covered at all. Now, the reason for that is just generally economics. You don't have as many people in rural areas, people are not willing to pay as much for coverage, and certainly they're not willing to pay for new technologies. The reason for that is that the historic reason that you've not had this coverage is not a good reason, however, to not aspire for it in the future. There is a huge benefit that you can get in increasing not just coverage, but a good quality of service in rural areas. On the previous slide, you saw that rural areas often, even if they do have coverage, are only covered by 2G or 3G. But this effectively means that they are suffering compared to urban areas because they don't have a good quality of service. They aren't able to access the same number of services and the same type of services as those in urban areas. And it is well established, the GSMA has carried out a number of studies into this, and there have been a number of academic studies which you talk about in our report, which show that the economic well-being and the social well-being of people in rural areas can be hugely increased if they are able to access very high quality mobile or generally internet services. This is, as the overall title of this this webinar implies, something that we consider as a significant digital divide at the moment. Urban people have access to services that rural people do not. And I should be clear, in this presentation I'm focusing on rural and very deep rural use. In our report, we also do talk about things on transport links. We talk about semi-rural areas and so on, places where people may go for the weekend away from urban areas. All of these things can be benefits as well. But it's very important from the digital divide point of view to think about these deep rural areas. So how do we serve these deep rural areas? Well, the only way of doing it really is by UHF. And as I mentioned before, there are two reasons why historically and currently there is a kind of this poor level of coverage and poor service quality. First of all, you've got low levels of demand because there are not many people there to spend money. And secondly, there are higher costs of network deployment. Reaching remote areas can be very difficult. You don't have a ready-made fiber backbone to hook onto. So the only thing that we can try and do is to reduce the cost of deployment and make sure we can increase the capabilities of the network. And to do that, the only way that you can do that is by using an increased amount of UHF for 5G services. We've got a table down at the bottom there that looks at how you can try to how you can measure or how we can estimate the bandwidth and the speed that's available at different spectrum. We've got a 700 megahertz band there that shows that a 2x10 block at 700 megahertz can at the moment do about 111 megabits a second. You can see other bandwidths are much better and would give a much better result. If we are able to allocate more UHF spectrum in the to 5G, then we'd be able to increase that bandwidth and the speed that's available to rural areas to try and make it a little bit more equal to those that are recognized in urban areas. So it's very clear that mobile services can make good use of further UHF spectrum. Against that, we need to think about its use in broadcasting, in television broadcasting. Now, as I've mentioned before, previously, television had access to a very large bandwidth from 470 up to 862 and actually beyond that. In WRC 07, that was cut down to below 800 megahertz. WRC 15 cut it down to below 700 megahertz. The other bands are used for mobile. However, in WRC 15, it was agreed that the lower band, the 224 megahertz that is listed here, would not be looked at WRC 19. It could be next looked at WRC 23, which is the next conference in 2 years' time now. So we need to think about, is this still an appropriate way of allocating this for television? DTT services are well established, we say here, and they have been in place for a number of years now. It's not just DTT services, obviously. We're talking about television in general. They are a well-established social construct, and although they may have moved from analog to digital and increased number of channels or reduced number of channels and so on, it's still a very important communication method for a large number of countries. However, the use of DTT by country does vary. The map on the left-hand side here it illustrates this. You've got a solitary country there, Switzerland, which is in pink because they have no national DTT multiplexes in use. You have a number of other countries which have between 1 and 3 multiplexes, and the majority, I'd say, have between 4 and 6 in use in terms of national multiplexes. Some also have regional, some don't, and then there are also a few paid DTT services that are included. Now, what is quite interesting when you look at this map is that as soon as you see countries that have less than 4 and probably less than 6, then you can start to work out how much spectrum is needed to carry those. Now, theoretically, 6 multiplexes only require 48 megahertz of spectrum in any particular location. But the problem is that in order to make sure that you don't interfere between broadcasting towers, you need to have different sets of spectrum at different broadcasting towers. And as a result, you end up kind of multiplying up the amount of spectrum that's needed. It's quite important to note that it makes DTT an inherently inefficient use of spectrum for the way it's used. But of course, we'll come on to PMSE and its use in the white spaces later. But having said that, as I say, 6 multiplexes could be run in 48 megahertz in any specific location. Less than 4 that would definitely not require 224 megahertz of spectrum. And what is quite surprising is that when you compare the map that you have here to the map of the responses to an ITU questionnaire about how much spectrum is needed, the vast majority of countries which have got less than 6 multiplexes in use say that they still need to have 224 megahertz of spectrum available for broadcasting. There are countries which have got 2 channels, 2 television channels being broadcast using on one multiplex, which still say that they need to have 224 megahertz of spectrum available for broadcasting. So there's a bit of a disconnect here between what is being used and what people think is needed. The other thing to note is that it's changing over time. I mentioned earlier that Switzerland no longer has DTT in place, and that is a relatively new development. I think it was 2019 it was turned off. But all over the world, we can see that DTT is slowly falling in terms of its market share. Satellite is falling faster, it must be said, and the real winner is IPTV, so over the internet channels and so on. But DTT is falling in terms of its use. And one of the reasons for that is that it has some kind of limitations in terms of technology. You can't have interaction on it. There's a very limited amount of on-demand services that you can do if you have kind of a hard drive technology attached to your receiver. Generally, DTT is designed primarily for linear TV services, and it suffers from this. And there's a very interesting some very interesting research that was done by Ofcom on the next slide that shows how this is changing over time and how this affects DTT. On this chart, on this page, you have 2 different graphs. One looking at total video viewing time on the left-hand side, and as you can see, there's a very large amount of live TV, which is the magenta area at the bottom there. That is falling over time, but it still represents a kind of pretty significant chunk of time. The pale blue, the service video on demand, that's things like Netflix and Amazon Prime Video and so on, that is increasing. If you look on the right hand side, this is UK adults, but only those under 35. And the picture is very, very different. The amount of live TV is becoming tiny. You've got YouTube itself is a very large amount of time. In fact, YouTube is larger than live TV. And Netflix and the other service video on demand is the majority of not the majority, but the largest slice of viewing time. And of course, the thing about people who are under 35 is that eventually they will not be under 35 anymore, and the overall adult population will start to look in the same way. And of course, the thing is that all these different things that are required in terms of video on demand and the massive choice of programming cannot be carried and cannot be catered for on DTT. So we sort of have this conclusion that the future for DTT is pretty unclear. There is increasing competition. There is a falling share of the market. In some places, then we've seen that DTT has been turned off or reduced. So in Flanders and Belgium and in Switzerland, public broadcasters shut off the DTT networks. Some paid DTT providers have switched over to internet, to IP distribution, and yeah, the picture across Europe is generally similar in terms of a reducing proportion of DTT, although the starting point varies significantly, as we talk about in our report. Across the Middle East, then the television market is characterized by kind of relatively sparse DTT channels, and there's a lot of satellite usage. We did a study back in 2016, I think, that looked at the Middle East television market and found that it could generally be catered for in the first band of UHF as well as VHF. But it is important to note that there are a number of countries, particularly those in Southern Europe and in Africa, where DTT is very important. It's important because it's had a very high market share and continues. And in Africa, especially, although there's a linear TV, a decline in linear TV, there's a large dependence on DTT because of its accessibility. So that was the television broadcasting side. We also have to think about other services, and I'm just going to quickly talk about these. PMSD is a very important user. It generally at the moment operates in white space, and when I say white space, it's where television broadcasting DTT is inefficient. There are areas where PMSD can be used where it doesn't interfere. It's very hyperlocal, as in you're not going to be trying to send these signals over kind of more than a kilometer. And generally, we find it's used in urban areas, because that is where things like television studios and arenas and so on are placed. And there are occasional rural uses for things like festivals, Glastonbury, and so on. But generally, PMSD is a very local and urban user. It currently uses a lot of spectrum, and there are a number of reasons for that. A lot of the wireless microphones are analog for two reasons. Firstly, because of a very low latency that's required, and secondly, because historically that's what they always were, and you don't replace something unless you need to. But there's no need for everything to be analog. There's no need for everything to continue as it was, and there are ways that we can actually reduce the spectrum requirements for PMSD without affecting their use and their ability. So moving to digital technologies where possible, use of 5G technologies, which will kind of cut down latency. Probably not for everything. It won't be able to compete with analog for kind of below 5 milliseconds latency, but for some things you can use that. And the other thing is possibly a geographic ring fencing proposition, so that PMSD can continue to use this without being interfered from mobile or from anything else, as long as they are they construct their studios accordingly. So there's an important use for PMSE, and each regulator needs to make sure they take account of this when they're making any decisions. Another user is radio astronomy. It requires a small amount of spectrum. It is currently a secondary user of the DTT band, effectively, but most countries do have a recognition that it should be kind of kept free from interference. There is an argument that that this should be given a co-primary status with DTT in that very small band to make sure that there is no interference or as little interference as possible. But again, it can vary by geographic location. It can vary by country. And the last thing that's worthwhile talking about is PPDR. Now, PPDR is emergency service use of mobile communications, effectively. There are a number of ways that this has been done in the past. First of all, there are some dedicated bands, and in the past, things like the Tetra bands down in 380 and 410 has been used. It's important for PPDR that they do have access to UHF, because they will often need to get signals through large buildings or over long distances. In the UK, they have kind of previously been using a kind of very low, I say low, it's still high frequency band for that, but they're now moving over to a model where everything everywhere, or EE in the UK, will carry their traffic on their network. Other places in Europe have been reserving certain bands for PPDR within the 700 megahertz spectrum, and you can see here that there was a CEPT study that looks at this, and they came up with the best option being option B, where you have PPDR spectrum above and below the main 700 megahertz band. That still gives you 2 by 8 megahertz of spectrum, which is not enough to run high quality 5G services over there. So instead, you may end up with a hybrid model, which has this this dedicated spectrum, but also will have some 5G services run over mobile networks as a kind of supplementary method. So effectively, the points that we came to is that any additional spectrum that mobile is able to have is going to benefit PPDR as well, and regulators would be able to make requirements over priority access or quality of service to make sure that emergency services use of additional spectrum could be guaranteed. So I've mentioned this a few times now about flexibility, and it's very clear that there is a different use of DTT across the world, across region 1 in particular, even across 2 different countries in Europe, neighbouring countries in Europe. So it's very important that regulators are able to take account of their local situation when it comes to making decisions about use of UHF. We have come to the conclusion that there should be a co-primary allocation between mobile and DTT, and radio astronomy in the band where it currently sits. I do say at the bottom there about radio astronomy becoming a secondary use, but it can be argued that it should be primary as well. In some countries, spectrum under 700 megahertz is very underutilized at the moment because DTT is not using it. In other countries, it's very heavily used. What we would like to see is regulators given the opportunity to work amongst themselves, but also take account of the needs of their country in order to allocate this spectrum to the services that they feel would best benefit the country. There are, of course, some things that need to be done in terms of interference across borders and making sure that all users of spectrum, PMSE and radio astronomy and PPDR, as well as mobile and broadcasting, are taken account of. But that is the conclusion that we have come to. So that is the end of the presentation. As I said, it's been a quick run through of the main highlights of our report, and I do urge you to download our report and have a look through it. And I will open the floor for any questions. Richard, I think you are going to go through questions.
Indeed, yeah. Sorry. Hope you can hear me. So just to confirm, you are able to download the full report from the GSA website. We'll share that in a post-event email with you, so you will be getting that soon. In terms of questions, again, please do pose any questions that you have in the chat function, and we can work through those as we go through. To start with the first question, Tim, we talk about the sort of the increase in data traffic, and wondering whether that can be addressed by new technologies which are more spectrally efficient.
Okay. The answer is partially. We did talk about this in the report, and obviously moving from LTE to LTE-A to LTE Advanced Pro to 5G is increasing the efficiency of spectrum. It is increasing the speed of and capacity of networks, but the
I hope that everyone can hear me now. Tim, can you hear me?
sorry, I think I got.
Hi, Richard. Seems we have Tim is back. That looks good.
Okay, sorry. I think that I got dropped off there. So just to run through my answer again, because I'm not sure how much you heard of it. The answer is that partially new technologies can address the increase in demand that's needed, but overall there is it's increasing exponentially much faster than technology is increasing, and so therefore we should be aware that you do need to have additional spectrum or additional capacity in some way to allow for that.
Perfect. And looking at, I guess, a little bit at the market mechanisms, do you see a role for the market in determining what the best use will be of spectrum, whether that's through fees, through auctions? What sort of role in the market in defining what the future will be?
Oh, very good question. So obviously there have been some experiments about this in the past, and things like the US reverse incentive auction kind of sort of went down this road. One of the issues that you have if you're looking at purely market-based mechanisms to look at the use of spectrum, so effectively, if you're looking for a purely market-based mechanism, you just say, here is a block of spectrum. Broadcasters and mobile operators can both bid for it, and they can use it however they like. Well, first of all, you've got a coordination issue about how you actually go and run the services on it afterwards. But secondly, what that doesn't do is necessarily to take into account things like policy priorities and social welfare issues in the country. Historically, although DTT, as I said earlier, is not an efficient use of the spectrum in many ways, in many countries it's an important social construct, and it must be kept. Politically, it's important that they keep it going for a bit longer, and so therefore it's a purely market-based mechanism would fall short if you were to try and do that. However, there are some good arguments as to why, if you made adjustments for that and made people pay at different amounts due to social welfare, or if you can try and get mobile operators to guarantee service to people and so on, then you'll end up with a market-based mechanism that could work.
Okay, just building on that, you kind of touched on that in that very last comment, really, in terms of I guess, what sort of some of this DTT spectrum? Will that be the quid pro quo that they have to suck up, and also similarly in terms of different geographical markets where perhaps there's lower use of DTT? I think there's a great opportunity, for example, in Africa and Middle East for UHF to be used in a different way.
I'm afraid I didn't catch all the question. The internet broke up a bit, but in answer to the question that you asked at the end there, then yes, I mean there is actually a good opportunity here for places where there is existing low DTT use to make use of the UHF spectrum much quicker. And you mentioned Africa and the Middle East. There is an interesting point that those are the areas that can probably benefit the most from more UHF. There are areas in Europe that are very rural, but the very large rural areas in Africa and the Middle East are the places where UHF, a kind of a very large UHF band, providing a kind of a high quality service, can bring the most benefit. So absolutely, there's an opportunity there for effectively a bit of leapfrogging if they are enabled to use the spectrum.
A question here again regarding the co-primary allocation. So some member states are opposing co-primary allocation to mobile services. Do you think it's time to move from exclusivity to complementarity?
Well, I think that the outcome of our presentation is quite clear that yes, we do. Now, there's an interesting question as to why a country may be against the co-primary allocation of this spectrum. I'd love to say it's a Pareto improvement in that no one is worse off, but of course there will be people worse off sitting in the regulators who will have to do a lot more work in terms of making sure that the spectrum is being allocated in the right way. But overall, then there's a very strong argument for moving to a co-primary allocation. I mean, we're not saying that if you move to co-primary, then every country then has to take the entire DTT band and decide to either keep it as DTT or move it to mobile. They could decide to move the 600 bands out to mobile and keep the rest as DTT. It depends on the national needs of each country. But without giving the regulators this choice and this flexibility, then you're effectively making sure that they can't, that countries can't take advantage of the spectrum if they are able to.
Great stuff. And the first question, I don't think you quite caught. I'm wondering in terms of the operators, if they take some of this this spectrum, I say particularly the social nature of DTT, whether there'll be a quid pro quo that you can have the spectrum, but there need to be some universal service obligations or something that come with how it's actually used.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting kind of question about universal service obligations. I think a very kind of large majority of regulators actually do have things like coverage obligations, particularly on UHF spectrum. But what they don't have is some sort of requirements that people must offer service at a kind of a low cost, or have a kind of not necessarily free to access, but a low cost to access system. That may be needed, but I don't think that given the falling ARPU and the falling price of data over time, that is not necessarily going to be the case.
And you touched on briefly, this is in the full report, about the transport corridors as being a particular use case for UHF. I wonder if you could just give a quick taster on that, so there was more in the report, but just to whet people's appetites.
Sure. So I mean, in terms of the transport links, then the thing about transport links is that your options are even more limited. One of the things that we have looked at in terms of kind of rural areas and deep rural areas, but maybe villages within rural areas, is that they can be served theoretically by kind of a single fibre link and then fibre to houses. So therefore you can get very good quality connections that way. What you can't do on a transport link is to have a fiber going to each car that's moving. And increasingly, this isn't just about connected cars, because generally those are not going to be using the same sort of kind of 5G frequencies for their connected services, but it's actually for kind of the use of the documents within the car. They will, they increasingly want access to kind of good quality, kind of robust connections, so that they can be, watching video and so on. To get that over a kind of a large distance, and especially for kind of fast moving cars, then and change, the best thing that you can use is the UHF band. This is not, obviously you're not going to get a massive capacity for very dense urban roads, but this is looking at kind of transport links between large cities.
And a question regarding, again, UHF, and whether that's more sort of for addressing coverage or addressing capacity shortages, where sort of the balance, if indeed there is a balance to be had between those two requirements.
So this is a very important point and a very interesting one. And we always used to think about coverage and capacity as being two different things. Effectively, what you would do is to build up out a network that covered everywhere, and then you would add capacity where you wanted it. And the reason for that, it kind of dates back to when you started looking at GSM, 2G networks, that you just wanted people to be able to make a voice call, and as long as you could make a voice call, then you had the coverage. The thing is that people don't just want to make a voice call anymore, and they don't just want to be able to look at their emails and download a web page. They want to be able to stream high quality video. And so therefore, when you talk about coverage, you're not just talking about coverage, you're talking about the coverage of a sufficient quality. And so sure, you take 2 by 5 megahertz of spectrum and roll out an LTE network at kind of 800 megahertz across an entire country, and including rural areas. And there'll be some expensive areas to cover, where you probably wouldn't get your money back, but you could do it. The problem is that the people in those areas, they would have a mobile broadband connection, but they would not have a mobile broadband connection that enables them to use the same services and the same types of use as someone who's sitting in the middle of a city. So it's not just about coverage and capacity, it's about coverage with a suitable and good enough connection.
All right. And looking at the question here on sort of 5G broadcast, do you think new technologies, 5G broadcast, and upcoming 3GPP standards are going to change the DTT market? Do you think facilities for mobile and broadcast operators will converge to an infrastructure to provide all kinds of services?
It's quite possible. So 5G broadcast is certainly a promising technology, and it would obviously allow people to run 5G services alongside broadcast technologies. And I think that it's important to note about the fact that in the middle of the 700 band, you've got an SDL band as well, a supplementary downlink band that could theoretically be used for 5G broadcast as well. The thing is that as is the case with any move away from DTT to other technologies, you need to make sure that people have the equipment. And obviously there was kind of the big move away from analog to digital, and that took a large number of years to move across, and eventually ended up with people having to have subsidized set-top boxes. There is that there would be kind of quite a significant cost for consumers in replacing DTT receivers with 5G broadcast receivers. So although it's a promising technology, it may take a while to implement.
Great. So I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Looking at spectrum refarming, would there be an option to revisit underutilized spectrum band plans in 700, 800 and 900 megahertz bands to achieve increased capacity in a longer term perspective, sort of refarming 700, 800 and 900 bands?
To an extent there is. Obviously there are a number of places where they are turning off the 2G and the 3G networks, but often they're turning off 3G first. But there is there is still a requirement for 2G, especially in terms of old connected devices. And even if you do clear the 900 megahertz band from 2G and 3G, then that's still only going to be giving you another 2 by 10 per operator roughly. So yeah, I think the answer is that yes, absolutely, let's try and make sure that we do refarm these as much as possible, but we probably need to recognize that that's not going to solve all the problems.
And then I guess a final question before we sort of turn to the roundtable discussion. Your charts showed that DTT is sort of falling off as a percentage of viewing time, sort of the Netflix effect, I guess you'd say. Impossible to answer, but how long will it be until it's uncontroversial to turn it off?
It's going to vary by country. And not wishing to kind of palm you off with a non-answer, but that really is the fact that each country has got a different mix of market shares for different technologies, and it's all moving at different rates. It's a very cultural thing, and so I don't think it's possible to say that every country in the world should abide by a certain date for turning off DTT. And it's not just DTT. You do have to think about PMSE use in the band. You do have to think about the way that PPDR is being organised. So regulators, they do need to take account of all these things, and I will leave it to individual regulators to make estimates about how long it is until they turn off DTT. I'm more than willing for regulators to come and talk to me about it, and we can do it on a case-by-case basis. But let's just say, I think by the year 2200, then we may have no DTT left anymore. Perfect,
thank you. That almost feels like the perfect segue to go and ask the regulators and administrators what they think. So, Tim, thank you very much for that. So just to recap, we will be sharing the full report and a link to download immediately after this event. But I'll now turn you over to Lee and the roundtable. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Richard. I hope that sets nicely the scene now for a discussion here with our very distinguished panelists. We're very pleased to have them here. Let me briefly introduce them. I don't see Tariq's picture yet. So Tariq joins us from the United Arab Emirates and is the Executive Director of Spectrum Affairs Department of the country's Telecom and Digital Regulatory Authority. So he chaired WSC 12 and headed numerous other ITU groups and meetings. So he's currently the chairman of the ASMG, Arab Spectrum Management Group, and here today in his role for his national administration of TRDA. So thanks very much for joining, and welcome, Tariq. We have Eric Fournier from the French administration, ANFR. So he's, I think, very well known to all of us anyhow, with his many years of heading CPT, ECC, and other numerous roles in ITU, CPT in the EU, and would then mostly present the French administration here. Also, very warm welcome again. We have Ronald Legrange. Ronald is here with us from Namibia, where she heads the Electronic Communications Department in the Communications Regulatory Authority of Namibia, CRAN. There she's in responsibility for licensing, spectrum management, quality of service, infrastructure sharing, type approval, numbering, number portability, and so on. So the full range of topics also relevant for maybe other use of UHF. Again, she has numerous roles in international spectrum management work, maybe mostly relevant for today's topic, maybe her lead of the working group 2 on sharing and coexistence in the ITU RTG61, so the special group looking into the preparation on agenda item 1.5 in WSC 23. So again, welcome, Ronel. And we have Sergei Pastuk from the Russian administration with the Radio Research and Development Institute there. From his countless prominent roles in international organizations like RCC, CPT, and ITU, I'd like to highlight his role of leading TG61 in the WSC process. Also, welcome to Sergei. May I ask Tariq maybe to start with a few views on the study from the view, well, let's say the Arab world and specifically the United Arab Emirates. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Erland. You can hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you very much. And first of all, on behalf of UAE and on behalf of ASMG also, I would like to thank the GSA for inviting us to this excellent webinar, especially on this very hot subject, UHF spectrum closing the digital divide. Also, we'd like to thank Plum for their reports and for Tim for his excellent presentation about the usage of the UHF band in all world, and very good information that we have seen just right now in this representation. From UAE perspective or from ASMG, also Arab group, or how it's looking to this UHF band, as you're aware that there is and it's in item 1.5 in WRC 23, which is dealing with this issue. And Arab countries during the previous WRC was proposed that to have this ban to be studied. And the reason for that one, there are many Arab countries also, they are keen to use this ban for mobile services, for IMT technology or broadband. There are a number of countries that start already now in the process to start with this, using this band. Probably have seen maybe just our neighboring countries, Saudi Arabia already released a public consultation to in the 600 megahertz band to be used for mobile services. Also, there are many other countries using or they are having plan for using for DDT. But still many countries still not using for DTT. There are some few countries, UAE one of them, they used maybe few channels for DTT. In UAE, we already have one layer to be is using till now for DTT. However, even with that one, we try to put with many promotion or many things that to be advising people to use it, but still there are not much viewer or for DTT. And the reason for that one, not only UAE, it is also applied or applicable for all Arab countries. We are having very high percentage of using viewers by satellite TV or cable TV, but for terrestrial TV, it is very low, viewership, and we don't have that much. So for that reason, I liked from the Tim report, his presentation said that we have to give a choice to the countries. For those countries, how to utilize national matter to utilize the band, and that is what we are saying, that this band has to be given a chance to those countries who would like to use broadcasting. They can continue using broadcasting, or those would like to use mobile. Right now, we can see many countries that going for mobile, as we saw just right now in the reports, and some countries still not yet started. And now here, I just would like to mention one thing, important thing. Who's watching right now TV, terrestrial TV, or in general TV? It is those people who used to use TV, who used to watch TVs. But for a young generation right now, and the future generation, they are all using tablets, mobile, and others. Again, as a regulator, we have to see what is the national required, what is national need in order to regulate that services and to put a plan. And in the UAE right now, we are really looking forward to see how to use UHF band as a whole, but 600 megahertz, similar to our neighboring countries and some Arab countries. We are really planning to see it for mobile services. Also, we have just one last comment. We have a challenge a little bit with one other secondary services, as we just mentioned technology, which is PMSC for production making TV. As you all aware, UAE is one of the countries who's hosting a lot of events. And those events is required to, we are having a lot of requests, especially in our regulator here and with our team, a lot of requests for using PMSC, and sometimes we are facing difficulties to find frequencies for them for using wireless cameras or production TV. So we need to work also how to fulfill their requirement. I'm sure we can find it, but for our request and required for mobile services for IMT band, it is increasing, especially that in those countries already hold the band that being identified, allocated for mobile services, already being assigned and used by their telecom operator. So in general, a final just comment will say that let us give a choice to the countries or national administration to decide how to use the spectrum for to fulfill their needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tariq. So maybe Eric, would you want to go next to give a bit of a French perspective? You seem to be on mute still, Eric. Okay. Any technical issue, or should we maybe change the order?
Thank you, and sorry for that. There was a technical issue. And thanks to GSA also for organizing this webinar. This kind of exchange are important for regulators to understand how regulation should accommodate, facilitate innovation, even if for this specific issue it will be quite challenging. So immediate reaction to the nice presentation from Tim. So yes, mobile coverage of rural area, that's very high in the political agenda in France, and I think that's the same for all European countries. In France, we have the New Deal, where mobile operators are committed to ambitious rural deployment against some moderation in spectrum pricing, to say it in a nutshell. And it's very clear, I would certainly agree with Tim, that more access to UHF spectrum would be useful to this regard to help the operators. However, in spite of all that can be said on the increase on non-linear video and decrease or potential decrease of DTT, that DTT is remaining essential for a country like France. We have today about 50% of households receiving DTT, with something like slightly more than 20% having DTT as the only platform. So it's remaining essential for citizens to access television. There was a slide in the team presentation comparing 2013 to 2019 and with a decrease of only 3% of the DTT. So that's really showing that in the 30s, after 2030, there would still be high demand for the terrestrial platform for digital TV in Europe. That's something which is quite clear. Not also that in France, the audiovisual law is being changed to give to the broadcasting authority, GSA, the tools to modernize the DTT platform. The introduction of ultra high definition on this platform is envisaged, which would mean a transition from DVB-T MPEG-4 to DVB-T2 HEVC. And that's something which would require some time, which would require some investment, which would then requires some time to have this investment useful. Not also that there are also interest for this golden spectrum in the UHF band. Tim mentioned PPDR in one of the slides. Tariq mentioned PMSC, which is also quite important. And there are also some ideas for defense applications which are flourishing. So there's a lot of potential candidate for this frequency range, even if for the defense side it was more the lower part of the band. But what is important is that the primary user for us is broadcasting, and until the time when they would not need all of this spectrum, they need to be able to access to this spectrum. Now, I wanted to speak about this flexibility issue. So Tim is fully correct, Plum is fully correct that the DTT situation is quite different among European countries, and nobody would object that flexibility is a good thing by nature. Everybody applauds to flexibility. But the question for Europe is whether flexibility is possible in such small continent with small countries. The experience of 700 megahertz, 800 megahertz has demonstrated that the response is no, for Europe at least. We will have to decide together in Europe how this EU UHF decision will evolve after 2030, and flexibility will remain somewhat limited. Maybe we would be able to introduce some flexibility, but that would be, I think, to a limited extent. Just few figures stemming from our experience of 700, 800 megahertz. We had operators complaining about interference from DTT transmitter, which were more than 200 kilometers away, 200 kilometers. We had also international interference from Toscana in Italy to Nice in France. That's a long distance. We are still struggling to solve interference issue within the EU from broadcasting in Italy into Croatia. The level of interference to the Croatian coast, all the Croatian coast, reached something like 80 dB microvolt per meter, something like minus 50, minus 60 dBm at the input of a base station. So this kind of distance, 200 kilometers from the border, even for the largest EU country, which is France, it's prohibitive. So we have a real problem with that. That's what I would like the audience to recognize, that there's a difficult challenge here. From our side, we do not know the solution. We will study that for WRC23. We do not have some firm, strong position for WRC23. This is under study. But I'm sure about one thing, EU will have to move together on that specific issue. And when I'm saying EU, I'm also thinking border with CPT. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your views. So maybe we continue with Ronald. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And I see we have quite a lot of interest in this topic, gathering from the number of participants. First of all, my thanks to Plum Consulting for a very insightful document. In the case of Namibia, we have initially planned 4 multiplexes. At this moment in time, we have a 72% coverage, population coverage of DTT, mainly attributed to the public broadcaster on multiplex 1, whilst the other 3 multiplexes are in large unused. Given that we had an entity that deployed commercial DTT, subscription-based, but however they have opted for satellite, given the vastness of Namibia as a country. So this presents actually for us as Namibia a very interesting opportunity to really use the spectrum for other services. In that, the first layer of our network for the public broadcaster consists mainly of frequencies below the 600 megahertz, and also in part in the 174 to 230 megahertz band, which leaves us with a lot of white spaces in the DTT range. However, in Africa, like in many other countries, we have to be cognizant of the investments that has been made by governments and so forth to provide public broadcasting and to adhere to the GEO6 agreement. Namibia was indeed one of the countries that did make the ITU 2015 deadline for migration. At the same time, we also have 4 mobile operators that are covering Namibia at this moment, and 4 of them are providing 4G with the opportunity to move to 5G. Going forward. And for us, the lower bands are very important because of a vast country and small population, but everybody has to have access to services. COVID has put us in a very unfortunate position with the loss of tourism, where our tourism market was heavily affected, and we now have to look at more online opportunities, but for that we need proper broadband. And also the large number of schools. From the 1,800 plus schools, only 600 had broadband coverage. So education was a real problem in Namibia. So for us, this is a very interesting opportunity. We, however, also have to be cognizant of radio astronomy, as we do have radio astronomy services in Namibia. And we are also part of the SKA project together with South Africa and Botswana in this regard. But a co-primary allocation at this stage is an attractive proposition for Namibia, but views differs across the continent depending on the rollout of DTT and then also the uptake of the channels on DTT. Thank you very much for it.
Yeah, thank you, Ronel, for your insights. Very useful. Sergey, may I ask you to also present views now from Russia and maybe RCC?
Thank you very much, Ulrich, for this opportunity to express our position, our views, and our thoughts about this very important issue. Of course, we thank to GSA for organizing this webinar, and it's very timely, I would say, because this topic is highly discussed, and pretty soon we will have a TG61 meeting dealing with agenda item 1.5, where this issue will be highly discussed. And this report from PAM is also very, very interesting, and is in time because it covers the issue of spectrum needs and spectrum usage in our region, Region 1. So saying this, I also know that there's quite many important issues and elements in this report where is fully in line with what RCC is thinking. But at the same time, there is also some topic which is in contradiction what our position currently in RCC is. So first of all, I admit that yes, indeed, we see that non-linear TV is growing, particular for younger generation, and linear TV, usual broadcasting, in this respect is less spectrum efficient, actually. So if you look at the situation when all users are looking at non-linear TV, in this case, it's obviously that a cellular network like 5G provide much better possibilities to present and to provide the efficiency of spectrum usage. And at the same time, if you go to the other extreme, when all the people looking at linear TV, in this case, broadcasting is much more spectrum efficient. And we are facing the situation when both of these two users with a different number of percentage between them who look in linear and non-linear broadcasting, will be a reality and become a reality. And from this extent, this is definitely, we need to have some more flexibility in order to provide possibility for all the users, and at the same time to have a spectrum efficiently used. And with this regard, most problematic for us from the report was the idea that such flexibility can be reached by the primary mobile allocation in the radio regulation. So we know that these two services do not have good possibilities to be compatible. And in this respect, we've heard from Eric also there's experience from 700 and 800 megahertz where we have interference cases, and there is quite a huge distance. In RCC region, we have this situation because we have border with region 3, and some countries who wishing to implement in 700 mobile services are actually blocked by their neighbor because they are using broadcasting service, and there are no possibilities for such countries to implement mobile service, and they have this problem. So this is our experience from 700 megahertz when we have broadcasting and mobile allocated on a co-primary basis. So this is actually problematic. We've heard also from the report that for the 6 multiplexes we need only 48 megahertz. But this is just, I would say, ideal cases when you have a country without any border and no one except you plan the usage of spectrum. But we have a Geneva 06 plan, we have neighbors, and in this respect, it's obviously that 48 megahertz to have 6 multiplexes, and at the same time to get agreement with your neighbors, it's not realistic, it's not possible to reach. So from this perspective, we look at the current spectrum usage both by broadcasting and mobile in the overall frequency band below 1 gigahertz. And in this respect, I can say that we already reached the stage when the number of frequencies allocated to the mobile is more than to the broadcasting. And at the same time, I admit that broadcasting actually is, in many countries, it's almost the only frequency band where DDT could be delivered. So we note also that for the mobile services, the current usage of the band above 694 megahertz, actually it's only 70% of spectrum for INT due to the need of this gap between FDD, downlink and uplink. So this is something which is also probably for the future need to be looked at and improve the possibility of using this spectrum more efficiently. While of course we know that this gap are filled by PPDR, some PMSE, and so on. And there is also a little possibility, at least in the, I would say, middle 10, 15 years, it's actually not possible to do so. But at the same time, to switch from the 2G, 3G to the 5G in this frequency band is also a good possibility to address the capacity, traffic, and coverage, which is required in RCC country as well, of course. And finally, I just would like to stress that we note that all the report from the operator, from the market researchers and so on show us that traffic is growing for the mobile service, and growing mostly because of the video. And one more time, I stress that video, we will face the situation when we have non-linear users and linear users, which in videos. And in this respect, this flexibility that we wish to address for the lower part should not become a deregulation, I would say. And we look at this situation that flexibility need to be done in order to give the possibility in this lower frequency band to use non-linear technology like 5G broadcasting, maybe some other technology dealing with the supplementary downlink for the mobile service. And such approach, we believe, give us possibility to have a harmonized approach in the overall region, while addressing the demand of particular countries when they have different requirements and different user behavior linking to the non-linear, for example. So to sum up, currently RCC and Russian Federation are still, I would say, on the agenda item 1.5, considering and studying this issue, and this report is very timely for us as well. Preliminary position is that yes, we need to have flexibility, but at the same time, this flexibility should not lead us to deregulation and should not create a problem for the countries on the usage of spectrum. And with this, I just may indicate that current position is that proposed in this report idea of having co-primary allocation may be difficult for us to accept, and we think that it's too strong approach which will lead to more deregulation and create more problem, rather than resolve and address the issues we are facing in the usage of broadcasting and mobile in UHF band. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergey. So for very detailed insights and very detailed considerations. So unfortunately, we are almost approaching the end of the webinar. So maybe some 5 minutes to go. Maybe I can try to wrap up a little bit. So we seem to have quite some agreement that certain flexibility and certain choices would be desirable. But then we also certainly acknowledge that there are legacy to be considered, mainly DTT, also PMSE, the radio astronomy, and so forth, and that technically flexibility may not be that easy. So I think, Eric, from you, I've heard these issues with maybe 200-kilometer coordination distances, but those mainly, I think, refer to uplink protection of mobile systems. So let's say from Sergey, for instance, I've heard this need on video performance, video capacity, that would be mainly downlink. So I think that there could be ways to explore, on the one hand side, along country borders, certain coexistence possibilities, maybe between DTT and maybe mobile downlink. There could be possibilities to look into those even within countries, though that may become much more difficult if there is, let's say, a large rooftop reception population. with directional antennas and wideband amplifiers at the TV antennas. So let's say from a GSA perspective, we would very much welcome to really look at this full range of options. Certainly GSA as a mobile supplier organization has a definite interest in a co-primary mobile allocation, but we believe that really the economies and the populations of all countries in Region 1 could benefit from certain flexibility and choices carefully taken. So with this, I think we will present the report anyhow publicly now on the GSA webpage as well as on Plum's webpage. We hope to bring it also to the attention of respective meetings in the near future, and really hope to be able to contribute with the report to the discussions and eventually decisions in the World Radio Conference. So we certainly need to note these very different targets based on these diverse usages on UHF throughout the region. So with this, I guess we can come to an end. I would like to thank very much Plum for all the study. Oh, I see Richard is back. He seems to have had some issues. So let me thank Plum Consulting, the team, Tim and all his team for all the quite extensive work on the report, providing us with that information. Very many thanks to our distinguished panelists. I think this had been great insights also from the regions, and I look forward to further discuss with you whether it is in smaller rounds like this or then the big meetings. And also very big thanks to our audience staying with us during these 90 minutes. I hope we could provide some new insights and some points for further discussion. So Richard, can I hand it back to you? Would we have the link to the report ready for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Uli. So the link will be sent out immediately after this event, together with a recording. So you'll get that email as soon as this event closes. So once again, thank you for joining. There is more data on the state of low, mid, and high band spectrum around the world. Obviously on the GSA website, gsacom.com. You can find executive summaries of the reports available for free download. If you need more granular detail to dig into it more, then the Gambod database is what you're after, and that's the service that's available for GSA members and GSA associates. Again, to keep in touch with GSA, please do follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, WeChat, and Weibo. And again, if you visit gsacom.com, you can subscribe to the Research Digest email, which goes out every week, and also notifications of new reports. And finally, the next event from GSA is on 24th of June, and that's really going to be a recap of the year to date on all that 5G data, networks, spectrums, devices, all the sort of the key 5G milestones that we've seen in the first half of 2021. So please do join us for that. With that, many thanks again to all our panelists and to Tim for the presentation, and we'll draw this event to a close. And if you have any questions, please do drop us a line. Many thanks.